I'm Catherine Bowen, one of two senior policy advisors at the BVRLA, and I lead on decarbonisation, air quality and future of transport. Okay, so I'm going to speak to you this morning about the fleet journey from ICE to EV. So we've obviously recently had the announcement around the end of petrol and diesel vehicle sales, cars and van sales from 2030. So I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail, and also some of the challenges that we're going to need to overcome. So first of all, just to put it into a little bit of perspective, BVRLA members are responsible for over 5 million vehicles on the UK roads. 1 in 8 cars, 1 in 5 vans and 1 in 4 trucks will be owned and or operated by a BVRLA member. We purchase 50% of all new vehicles that are sold in the UK per annum. And more recently, we're responsible for buying 80% of all battery electric vehicles that are coming into the UK. So in terms of how we can support the uptake of EVs, I mentioned the 80% of all new BEVs that are being purchased. This is mainly because some of the changes we've seen to the benefit in kind taxation. So people are now incentivised to take an electric vehicle as a company car, who ordinarily may not have been ready to do that. So our members give a sort of try before you buy experience. So whether you're using a car club, rental, or even some of the sort of shorter leases, it gives people the opportunity to sample that vehicle, see if it's going to meet your needs, and then look at if that's something that you want to roll out across the fleet. Because of the regularity of fleet cycles, our members are also putting affordable second-hand, nearly new vehicles onto the second-hand market. So around 1 in 5 vehicles on the second-hand market comes from a BVRLA member. And the average fleet cycle for a rental vehicle is around 12 months, whereas for a lease vehicle, it's around 3.5 to 4 years. So because of those changes we've seen in the company car market, in the next 3 to 4 years, we'll really start to see a lot of more affordable vehicles coming onto the second-hand market. So I wanted to talk then about the phase-out announcement. So the Prime Minister announced this last month as part of a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. And as I'm sure you all now know, the proposal is that the end of petrol and diesel cars and vans will be 2030, but hybrids have been extended until 2035. We very much welcome that extension. I think we were concerned that if we phased out hybrids too soon, particularly when there are still challenges around supply and infrastructure, that may potentially have left us sort of exposed with no plan B. So it's really a bit of an insurance policy. So we were really pleased to see that extension for hybrids. And government will be consulting on what constitutes a hybrid in the new year. So in terms of the approach that we took when responding to this consultation, it was very much about a segment-driven approach. So whilst we recognise that some part of our sectors are ready and raring to go and could easily make the transition ahead of 2030, there are others who have got some quite significant challenges where, to be honest, 2030 or even 2035 was going to be a hard push. So we really wanted to sort of put it across that there is no one date fits all, and that support is going to be very much tailored to individual use cases across 3 key areas really. One is supply, to ensure that the UK remains a viable marketplace. Demand, to ensure that there are ongoing and strong incentives that stimulate that demand. And then by far, I would say the biggest challenge is around infrastructure and making sure that that gets rolled out in a timely manner. So in response, we really said that we welcome the clarity on the date, but this is only just the beginning. And I'm going to talk through some of the challenges across those 3 key areas now. So in terms of barriers, we know that the plug-in van grant, car and van grant is going to end. The van grant can be very complicated. We've had a lot of feedback to say that it's over complex and needs simplification. And we also need to make sure that the total cost of ownership model can stack up for those who are looking to make a business case for the investment. So on that area, we really need to see sort of future tax certainty. A lot of people are saying what's going to happen with road user pricing. And we need to know that now so that when people are putting that sort of business case together, they've got the confidence to do that. On the supply side, there is limited supply, particularly in the van market where this is especially constrained. So not only are there limited models, but there are also challenges with volume across those models. And also because of the really bold commitments that a number of companies have made to decarbonise ahead of 2030, a lot of the stock that is being produced is already pre-allocated. There's also an issue around specialist vehicles. So particularly those vehicles that are going to need constant onboard power at the roadside. So the ones that are powering up, you know, using the engine to power up pneumatic drills, lay cables and things like that, where we don't think the battery is going to be sufficient. And although these are small in terms of fleet size, they have a really critical role because they are putting in critical national infrastructure. There's also some concerns about how competitive the UK is and whether we see better incentives elsewhere across the UK. And then on the infrastructure side, one of the big challenges is around the grid upgrade process. So some of our members are being told that they're tripping the grid over its capacity and are being quoted figures around the £100,000 to £150,000 mark just for one site to reinforce the grid. And the process as it currently stands is if it's you that trips the grid over capacity, you have to pay the full cost. So this is a significant issue for a number of our members. And then for those who have invested to put in that infrastructure and done the grid reinforcement, the lead times can vary and some of them are very long. So some of our members are being quoted over a year and in some cases even over 18 months to go through that process. So that's another issue that needs to be overcome. We also have what we're calling the constrained. So this is basically where people need to take their work vehicles home and probably won't have a driveway to be able to charge. British Gas are actually estimating that around 65% of their engineers won't be able to charge at home. So this is a real problem that they're going to need to overcome, to look at how they're going to be able to get those vehicles charged, particularly overnight, and how they then reimburse their employees and change the terms and conditions and things like that. There's also ongoing issues around public charging, so things like the ability to roam, the inability to pay by debit and credit card, reliability standards where sometimes it's not until people arrive at a charge point that they realise that it's out of order. And also, particularly for vans, there's an issue around accessibility. So a lot of the charge points are built for smaller vehicles or for cars. So there's a huge issue that's going to be need to overcome, particularly in the CV, for the commercial vehicle market. Rapid charging is something that we need to see more of and away from just the motorways. We need to make sure that there's good provision in our towns and city centres, but also in more rural locations. And then data access is also a problem. So this is where some of our members are using a variety of different charge point providers and having to tailor the back-end systems to communicate with each of those different charge point providers, whereas ideally they'd want one standardised way to do that. So in terms of some of the recommendations that we put forward as part of our consultation response, on the demand side, we want to see the continuation of grants and incentives. So we want to see the plug-in van and car grant extended. Simplification of the van grant is absolutely essential. And we want to see the van benefit charge remain at 0%. On the infrastructure side, we welcome the forthcoming consultation for the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, which is going to look at some of the issues around reliability standards and ease of payment and things like that. But it needs to be as easy to charge up as it is to fill up. And we are starting to see some companies roll out a fuel card equivalent, but we need to see more of this if we're going to start to sort of really scale up. We've also asked whether the Automated Electric Vehicle Act should be used to enforce reliability standards, so we don't have the problem where it's only when people turn up at the charge point that they realise that it's out of order. And then on pricing visibility, we'd like to see illuminated tariffs in the same way as we do now with petrol stations, so people can clearly see and make a choice on how much they're having to pay for the charging. I mentioned some of the issues on data access, and again, this is going to be part of the forthcoming consultation on consumer experience. It's going to look at data sets. But there are certain data sets that absolutely need to be open and available to all, and they're things like location, availability, state of repair, and pricing. And as I mentioned before, we'd like to see one industry standard API so that people can extract that data easily. We've also asked whether there should be an ISO standard that enables the vehicle to talk effectively to the charge point, and making sure that there's a requirement that they are compatible. So a number of our members are having to use telematic devices in the vehicles to alert them to when the vehicle is fully charged. But there's a big question mark around how scalable that's going to be as we get more and more electric vehicles on fleet. So the ability for them to talk to each other is absolutely crucial. And I mentioned the accessibility point. So we want to see more public charging that's suitable for vans, particularly those that may need secure parking overnight. And perhaps that's something that the building regs could take into account to make sure that there is secure overnight parking for particularly vans where the drivers take them home and need to charge them overnight. And then rapid charging, we'd like to see this extended beyond the motorways and main roads. We'd like to see more provision in our towns, city centres, at transport hubs, and also in more rural locations as well. And then on the grid upgrade side, we'd like to see a re-evaluation of the whole process. So we understand that Ofgem are doing a review, but this probably won't come into effect until 2023. So we need to make sure that there's some sort of support and guidance for those that do want to make that transition and upgrade the capacity ahead of that time. We've been working really closely with BEIS, the Department for Business, on some guidance for fleets. And some of that was launched yesterday on the Go Ultra Low site. So it talks through some of the things that people have to consider for the connection process. But in the new year, there's also going to be a process map and also some information on a gov.uk page. And this is something we've really pushed for, because at the moment, I think there's a lot of information in lots of different places where this all have sort of one centralized portal where people can get that information. There'll be a postcode checker so people can look at who their local DNO is. It will take you to the relevant part on the DNO's website. It will give further information around some flexible solutions so you can avoid the sort of tripping the grid over capacity. And as I said, it's going to have a really detailed process map that will signpost people to the relevant places to gather further information, and also where you can go for more help. So that's something, a really positive step that's come about, because ordinarily fleet operators have never really had to think about energy. So we find that the language can be quite complicated. It's very energy specific. So that's a really positive move. We'd also like to see more rural provision in the DNO's upgrade plans, and also look at whether somebody, whether it's a local authority or the DNOs, can take a kind of coordination role. So where there are people who are working in close proximity, who are all looking to upgrade and looking at the capacity issues, whether there's the opportunity for them to share costs, but also the risk of that upgrade. And one of the other challenges that will need to be overcome is renters' rights. So particularly where properties are leased and they don't always have the rights to be able to put the necessary infrastructure in place. So that's something else that will need to be addressed. And then on the supply side, we've heard a lot of talk about a mandate. Our concern is that whilst this may work in other parts of other countries, it's very difficult in the UK. There's no real comparison. We're worried it might be a bit of a blunt tool. And our main concern really is if the manufacturers are forced to make so many vehicles and supply them into the UK, that fleets may then be forced to buy a certain percentage of these vehicles. And the timing for that is going to be absolutely essential, because if the infrastructure isn't in place for some of our very specific use cases, then that's going to be a real problem. So that's our concerns around the mandate. But we will be talking to members early in the new year around different types of mandate, what might work, and really start to address this in more detail. And we know that the emissions targets are going to be replicated by a CAFE in the UK, but we do wonder if this is going to be enough, because if those targets don't actually count for anything, then how do we make sure that the UK remains an attractive marketplace for supply? And then the other point we raised, and this was really looking more at the HGV side, which was out of scope for this announcement, but we need to see a clear roadmap. So at the moment, there's no real clear sense of what the technology is going to be. We're starting to hear more about electric trucks, and then other people saying about hydrogen being the best solution, but it doesn't feel like government have really put a stake in the ground one way or another. So we want to have that clarity. We also think that this might help overcome some of the issues that I mentioned on the specialist vehicle side, if certain technologies available, but it might also help with van supply, because if that's coming from both the car market that's evolving into vans, but also coming from the HGV market that can go into the van market, and that might help on the supply side there too. So in terms of some of the next steps, we were really pleased to see that as part of the announcement, government committed to a delivery plan. We think it's really important that we have some very clear milestones and a glide path as to how we're going to meet 2030. We were disappointed that there was no differentiation between cars and vans. It was something that we stressed in a series of workshops with OZEV. But we've been very clear that the delivery plan needs to make that differentiation, because the challenges for cars versus vans are going to be very, very different. And so the glide path is going to differ. So the delivery plan has to acknowledge the difference between cars and vans. I mentioned HGVs and the clear roadmap. We understand that DfT will be consulting on the phase out for HGVs in the new year. There's also going to be a future of freight strategy, so look forward to seeing that. I mentioned the consultation that government are going to be doing on the definition of hybrids. And there's also going to be a green paper, which is basically going to address how we're going to get to 2030. So will it be via CO2 regs? Will it be via a mandate? And we also think this is where we've got the opportunity to push for exemptions for specialist vehicles on the grounds that I mentioned earlier. The Transport Decarbonisation Plan will be launched in spring. And there was some further information in the Energy White Paper yesterday that detailed some of what will be in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, and I think very relevant to today. So looking at things like considering future demand, so this is decarbonising how we get our goods, considering future demand, transforming last mile deliveries, and also looking at how we can optimise logistics efficiency. So again, we'll be doing a lot of work as that gets launched in the spring. OZEV have also committed to publishing a national EV infrastructure strategy. I mentioned the consumer experience consultation that's due out anytime soon. There's also a competition markets authority study that's being run at the moment to look at whether there's going to be, are there any emerging competition or consumer issues that need to be addressed. So hopefully, the response to both of those will be taken into account when that strategy is launched. And then the other big change that we're going to see next year is outside of London's ULEZ, we're going to start to see the first clean air zones introduced. So Bath's clean air zone will go live in March, on March the 15th, and then Birmingham is set to go live on the 1st of June. This is going to cause a particular problem for HGVs where the penalties are quite high, but also there's no auto pay functionality, was something that we're really disappointed with. It basically means that people with large fleets are going to have to go on to the government's national portal and make payment for those vehicles that have entered the clean air zone one at a time. Also disappointed that the payment in arrears can't be extended from 6 to 7 days. So it's going to be quite an heavy admin burden on a number of fleet operators going into next year at a time that you could argue, they can ill afford that time or the expense. And I think this raises a really important part, which is we've got to be really careful about striking the right balance. We know there are going to be more penalties to help nudge people make the behaviour change towards decarbonisation, but ultimately we all want clean air, we all want to decarbonise, but we need to make sure that the penalties aren't set so high that actually we're limiting people's ability to make that transition to cleaner, more sustainable forms of transport. So that's my introduction. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions.